But we were talking about making a comeback to your city. And last week, we jumped into the book of what was called Nehemiah. That Nehemiah was a prophet in the Old Testament. And we talked about that God had called him to do something amazing. And God had called him back to his city. And if you remember what I told you, Nehemiah's job was a cupbearer to the king. So meaning, Nehemiah, what he would do is he would eat and drink the meals that were prepared before the king would to make sure that they weren't poisoned. And so what he would do is he would do that, and he would build such a relationship with the king that the king began to listen to him and began to use him as someone that was an advisor and that was wise. And so we see this, and we see that Nehemiah returns to his hometown of Jerusalem, and we talked about how Jerusalem had been destroyed. It had been left in ruin and rubble. The walls had been broken down of the city to protect it. They had just laid waste. The Babylonians had laid waste to it, and there's nothing left. But he said, you know what? I want to go back to my city, and I want to restore things. But when he got there, his heart was so heavy that he cried out to God. And remember, I said that he cried out to God for three things. Very specific. And I want you to think about this. He's not talking to a friend on Facebook. He's not talking to his mom or his dad. Nehemiah is talking to God, and he says these three things. He says, look at me, listen to me, pay attention to me. Now that to me is pretty intimidating when you're saying these things to God. You're not talking to just anyone. You're talking to God, and he's demanding of God, the God that you listen to me, that you look at me, and that you pay attention to what I'm saying, because I have something to say that's very important. And a matter of fact, we can say this. We can say that Nehemiah had a burden that was placed upon him. A burden that was placed upon him for his city and for what it is. And so what really is a burden when we think about this, when we think of the word burden and we think about how burden is something that goes on, a burden we usually think as like you're putting a book bag on and it's a burden, you got to walk with it, or it's something heavy that's placed upon you. You guys know what the word burden means. I don't have to explain it too well to you. It's something that you endure and that you bear. And when we're going through hard times, and we're dealing with situations maybe at home or at school or even at church or with our family, our friends, it doesn't matter who it is. Sometimes we feel burdened because of a situation that seems so heavy. And Nehemiah was so upset about his city, about returning to his home, that he was burdened. Nehemiah 1:4 says this, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Think about this. This dude sat down for not just a couple of seconds, not for a couple of minutes, but it says that he sat down for days and wept and cried. Now, we got to understand, like, how many of you have ever, you've ever cried? Let's be real. You ever cried? All right, cool. Now, how many of you have, ever really cried, were really upset? Okay. How many of you have ugly face cried, where you're crying so bad that your face has gotten ugly, your makeup's probably running, you got snot all over you, and you got the tears mixing with the snot, and you're choking and you're coughing and you're snotting and crying all at the same time? How many of you have ever done that? You know what I'm talking about ugly face crying. Nobody looks good when they ugly face cry. That's why they call it ugly face cry. This is where Nehemiah was. Nehemiah was so broken that the dude probably ugly-faced cried for days because he was so upset that his hometown, the place that he loved and honored and respected, his hometown where he was burnt down, and he mourned, and it said that he fasted and prayed for days. That's a burden. That's being so upset about this. And a lot of people will stop here and stop talking about the city and what had happened. And what we have to understand is that God is going to give you a burden for something. See, for me, God has given me a burden called youth. He's given me something that I love and I care about, and that's teenagers. That I have a burden for your generation, meaning that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to help your life be better and to help you become someone that God wants to use in an amazing way. And so my heart is burdened for some of you. As you grow older, your heart's going to be burdened for younger children where you want to help them. Maybe your heart's going to be burdened for people who have disabilities. Maybe your heart's going to be burdened for someone that's elderly. Maybe your heart's going to be burdened to help people medically or in his social work or whatever it is. Somewhere along lines, God is going to give you a burden for something. And so I want to talk about burdens tonight. Things that are placed upon our life that we have to deal with, and how do we deal with the burden when it's put upon us? And when we look at Nehemiah, we see some crazy things, because as you're in school dealing with everything that you're dealing with, there's gonna come some point where God puts a burden on your heart, like, hey, you need to go talk to that friend. You need to go talk to that one person that nobody wants to do with. You need to go talk to her or him, and you're gonna get burdened with something in your life, because there's someone in your school, there's someone in your family, there's someone in this youth group, there's someone in this city that God is gonna place on your heart, that he's gonna say, hey, you need to care about them and you need to love them. And what I find is that when I look at Nehemiah, I don't have this on the screen because I'm gonna summarize it. So I want you to think about this. You work for the king. You don't have just any job. You work for the king. You're his trusted advisor. You put your life on the line every time this guy goes to eat. And so what ends up happening is Nehemiah goes before the king and he says, listen, I need to go. I need to go back to my hometown. And the king says, well, why do you need to go back to your hometown? Don't you like it where you're at? Don't you like it where you live? And he says, no, king, I need to go back to where I lived and I worked at, because you have to understand that my city has been burnt to the ground and it's been reduced to cinders and ash. So then the king said, okay, what is it that you want? He said, I'm praying to go back to my city to rebuild it, to rebuild the walls of my city, to be able to do this. And I began to think about how Nehemiah did something that was really risky. Nehemiah did something that was really big. He went before the king, and not only did he go before the king sad, he went before the king asking to be let go of his job. So you got to understand something about how the times were back then. Your job as an advisor working for the king was to make sure the king was always happy. Imagine if you had that, imagine if you were king or queen and you had people that their whole job was to make sure that you were always happy. That was how Nehemiah was. Nehemiah was not supposed to go before the king ugly face crying. He was not supposed to go in front of the king and change the king's mood. But Nehemiah went in and risked it that one day. See, back then, if you changed the king's mood and you made him from being really happy to being really upset, he would just have you killed. He'd be like, nope, I'm just going to have this person killed because they changed my mood and they changed how I felt. And he would have him killed like that. So Nehemiah was risking going before the king upset. But the second thing was, he was going before the king. He was saying, hey, I know I got a good job. I know you paid me good money. I know I eat good food, but I need you to let me go. I need you to release me from my job because I got to go back to a different city and I got to begin to work on it. And he took a risk. And one thing that you have to understand is that when you have a burden for something, it's going to have a risk connected to it. We'll take risks for things that we're burdened for. So when you're burdened for certain things, you're going to take a risk. Whatever it is, whether it's people, whether it's a cause, whether it's a company, whatever it is, you're going to take a risk when you have a burden. Because you're going to care about something that you're going to step out on a limb and do this. For Nehemiah to approach the king with great sadness, he was supposed to bring joy, so he shouldn't have done that. But for Nehemiah to ask the king to leave his job to go to somewhere else, that's a bold move. Because the king could have said, well, why do you want to go back there? Are you being disloyal to me? Are you not being close? Do you not want to be close to me anymore? But understand this, that God perfectly orchestrated this. Perfectly said, you know what? I'm going to take place. I'm going to make sure that this happened. When you have something that's on your heart, guys, understand me. Everybody look at me. When you have something that's on your heart, it's going to take a risk to make it happen. When you're burdened with something, it's going to take a risk. It's going to take a risk. You're going to step out, and people are not going to understand. People are not going to agree. But guess what? You have to take a risk in order to make great things happen. And my question to you is, do you take risks? What are you burdened for? Are you burdened for anything? Do you have something that burdens your heart? Are you burdened for your family because you want to see God move in your family? Are you burdened for your friends that you go to school with each and every day? For some of you, are you burdened for your whole school district, your environment, your town that you live in? Last week, what did we talk about? We talked about how sometimes we hate where we're placed. We hate that we live in Altoona. We hate that we live in this area. We hate that we're from Blair County. We hate that we're from Tyrone or Bellwood. We hate being from Central PA. And we just hate where we're at, and we hate being here. And this is just the worst place ever, and we hate this place. And we talked about that last week. But I'm going to bring up an incident that just happened, and I want to bring some light to something. See, last week on January 12th, there was a basketball game going on at Altoona High School. And there's a situation that happened that night that really changed the light of a lot of things. See, back in September, Casey Ottaway's mom passed away, and they lost their mom. So during this basketball game, some students thought it would be funny to start chanting Ottaway's mom at him while he was playing basketball, cheering about this boy's dead mother. Began to cheer at him, and it broke him down in tears. And we kind of know what happened. It's been all over the news. We kind of see what happened where people began to react. And I don't know why they did this, but I can tell you this: it's disgusting and it's repulsive. It's not godly, it's not right, and it's wrong. The fact that students thought that this would be funny shows you the lack of respect that we have for one another. Shows you the lack of love that we can show one another. At a sporting event that's just about basketball, it's just a game, we're gonna bring up someone who passed away. Are you kidding me? It's repulsive. It should have never gotten to that point. But sometimes people do this. Do you know, as soon as this happened, I got a text message within minutes of this happening on Friday night. It only happened about 15 minutes later, and I got a text message saying what had happened, explaining to me that night. As someone who loves you guys so much and loves your generation, and as someone who loves Altoona School District and love what they're doing, this literally broke my heart but infuriated me at the same time. It literally caused something inside of me to get so stirred up and to get so angry and to get so mad because this is so wrong for this to do. And I'm going to tell you what we need to do, especially as Christians. We need to publicly address and say, listen, I apologize to the Ottawa family for what has happened. I apologize for the action of my classmates. I apologize for the way things happened because it was wrong and it should have never happened. And so this is me publicly apologizing, saying, I'm sorry. My prayers go out to the family. My prayers go out to Hollidaysburg. My prayers go out. And as I begin to see this, I'm thinking, man, like we need Jesus so much in our lives. Now, what we have to understand that not every student that attends the high school was involved in this. This was a handful of students that made everybody look bad. The saying goes, a couple apples that are rotten will spoil the whole bunch of apples. Following the night, after this event had happened, social media and even the news locally exploded with this story. There are comments on websites, blogs, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, comments everywhere that spewed hate and disgust of what had happened, but also of certain situations. These are actually, I'm going to read you 4 things that are actually from students who posted on social media. F Altoona School District, its leaders and its students. Screw Altoona. I hate my school and I hate what we stand for. Altoona is such scum and pointless waste of space on planet Earth. I hate Altoona. This place sucks. Not considered a mountain lion. Hashtag not a mountain lion. Hashtag hate Altoona. Now, I want you to understand the action of making fun of this boy's mother who passed away, 100% wrong. 100% wrong. It was not right in any way. And Altoona leadership did the best that they could with what they could in that situation. And a lot of people are just hounding and slamming and going against Altoona. Well, they should have done this, they should have done that. We're really good at saying we should have done something when we're on this side of it. See, I've had to do damage control before. I've had to be in positions where I've had to deal with people who have said stupid stuff and I've had to apologize for it. But can I tell you the response of like these students saying these things about your school district and about you and about the city that you live in should infuriate you. It should hurt your heart. The fact that people say these things. Why? Because I'm going to tell you this. We just celebrated a holiday of Martin Luther King Jr., who was an amazing man. And he said this: darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Do you know the only way that things are going to change in your school at Altoona, at Bellwood, at Tyrone, at Hollidaysburg, at Kimmel? You know the only way these things are going to change is if you have a burden for it to change. See, we're real brave behind a keyboard. We're real brave behind a cell phone. We can say whatever we want and not have to face the consequences of that. But what I want to tell you is that it should break your heart that this situation happened. It should break your heart that people are spewing hate against another school. It should break your heart because you should be so in love with where God has placed you. Remember, I said this last week, and some of you need to drill it into your brain until you say it over and over again, that God put you here on purpose for a purpose. That it's not a mistake that you're at Altoona. It's not a mistake that you're at the high school. It's not a mistake that you're in this area. You might have been like, well, this happened and that happened with my family, and that's why I'm here. Or I got dragged here, or I didn't choose to live here. It doesn't matter how you got here. The fact is that you're here, and God put you here on purpose for a purpose. But see, if we want to see things like what happened Friday never happen again, we need to have a burden for our school. It needs to be that place like Nehemiah went there and it burdened his heart because he was so broken. See, when Nehemiah rolled back into his city, it says this in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 11 to 13. So I arrived back in Jerusalem after I had been there 3 days. I got up in the middle of the night and had a few men who were with me. I hadn't told anyone about what God had put in my heart yet to do. The only animal with us was the one I was riding. Under cover of night, I went past the valley gate toward the dragon's fountain, and the dung gate looked over the walls of Jerusalem, which have been broken through and whose gates have been burned up. See, Nehemiah went back to Jerusalem to change his city because of his burden. When he got there, he didn't just sit back and not do anything. But see, he was done crying. He was done mourning the city. He got up off of his butt and he said, you know what? I'm going to go look through this entire situation of the city and I'm going to figure this out. See, a real burden will make you have risk, but a real burden will also, when a burden's on your heart to change, it makes you plan something. So a real burden will make you plan. How am I going to change? How are you going to change the school? How are you going to change your friends' mindsets? How are you going to push the hate out of this school district? And how are you going to push the hate out of your home? How are you going to push the hate out of your friendships? How are you going to push the hate out? Because listen, we live in a world of hate. It's all over, from the NFL to the White House, to where you go to school, to where you go to work, to where you go and hang out. Hate is going to be everywhere. But the only way that you conquer hate is by having a burden of love for those that are around you. Just like I said last week, if you're not intentional in your relationship with Jesus, you're never going to grow. You're never going to be able to do what you need to do and what are called to do. So when you think of your school, I want you to think of some different ways you can impact people in your school. How can you be intentional? Make it simple. Reach out to someone you've never reached out before. Or maybe it's talking to someone that you've never known your entire life, but just bringing up who Jesus is because it's the right thing to do. Let me ask you this. Across this room, how many of you go to school with people that need Jesus? Raise your hand. Every single person. Because you know why? We all need Jesus. See, we're all in church, but we still need Jesus. We're not there yet. We've not arrived to the place where I'm a super Christian. No, we still all need Jesus. And there are people that are at your school that should be sitting in these seats. This whole room should be full with your friends because they need Jesus. But it's up to you to have a burden, to take the risk, and to make the plan to make it happen. We're going to want to act on something and make a plan to conquer this hate. Nehemiah goes on and says this one last thing, which I want to show you. It says in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17 through 18, then I gave them a report. He said, face it. This is what he's saying to his men, face it. We're in a bad way here. Jerusalem is a wreck. Its gates are burned up, but come. Let's build the wall of Jerusalem and not live with this disgrace any longer. I told them how God was supporting me and how the king was backing me up. See, Nehemiah took his burden. He had been moved to act, and he said, listen, this is what we're going to do. And then he led people to the plan to make it happen. His burden was nothing more and then just saying, you know what? This is my emotional response. I'm going to be sad that my city has been torn down, but I'm actually going to do something about it. So he told his people it's time to go to work. I want everybody looking at me because I'm going to tell you this right now. It's time to get to work. It's time to get to work and to share love in your school like you've never shown before. I just want you to look around of how many people are here right now. Look around at how many people, let's just say Altoona High School. Look how many people represent Altoona that are sitting in this room right now. Can you imagine if every single person that attended the middle school and high school decided to go to school tomorrow and say, you know what, I'm going to change this school by loving people the way Jesus did? If all of you just in this room, managed to do that with 2 people and just showed 2 people the love of Jesus and continue to do that, you guys would cause such an eruption in the school, they wouldn't even know what to do with you. Because there'd be such a mass of love and of God and of grace that is going through your school. Why? Because you're going to care about your school. You need to care about where God places you. Because God doesn't place you places on purpose and just say, okay, you're on your own. No, God plans why you're there and says, you know what, I'm going to plan them there and I'm going to plant them there for a purpose. So you need to get a burden for your school. You need to get a burden for what's going on. So Nehemiah goes to his people and said, listen, we know this is bad. We know the school's rough right now. We know that things are hard. And listen, it's not just at Altoona. Grace and I can sit down and talk about Tyrone and what goes on in Tyrone. I got students at our Tyrone campus. Ryan and I can sit down and talk about the Bellwood campus. We can sit down and talk about any school in our area. But this is what I know. It's time to do something. We realize the world's in a bad way. We realize that things are screwed up. What are we going to do about it? Talked about last week. You're 3 types of person. There are 3 types of people that exist in this world. You can just sit back and not do anything. You can sit back and hope for something, or you can go ahead and do something. What are you going to do about it? We're going to look at next week when we see the people, how they respond and what God does in their hearts. But let me tell you this. When you have a burden that's inside your heart, it's going to take a risk to change your school. It's going to take planning to change your school. But I want you to understand that it's going to also take you acting and you actually doing it. Because what good is a plan if you don't do it? What good is a plan if you don't act upon that plan? Think about that. You can plan it all out to how you're going to win and how you're going to do all this. But what good is a plan? What good is having practice? What good is doing all of these things if you're not going to capitalize on it? How many times do we go along in life and we're planning to do something and then we don't do it because we're scared and we don't capitalize on what's going to happen? A real burden makes you act to do something. You want to see your school change, guys? Do something about it. I'm reading on social media all this hate of the school district, of the leaders, of the teachers, of other students. And I'm sitting here and I leaned back on my sofa after looking at my laptop. I shut it. I looked over at my wife and I said, they just don't get it. The very ones that are causing the hate in the school are the very ones that can change it. The very ones that sit there and blast the teachers and their fellow students, they're the very ones that can rise up and lead and change everything about the area of the school. Because see, let's just be real. There are people that watch you that want you to fail. Satan designed things so that you would fail. The enemy doesn't want you to succeed in what you're doing. He wants you to get kicked out of school. He wants you to start fights in the cafeteria. He wants you to go at that girl on social media. He wants you to go and backtalk your teacher and put her in her place. No, he wants you to do these things. Why? Because it keeps love from being shown in the school. It keeps love from being shown in what God can do. So what we need to understand is that we need to have a real burden that makes us take risks. We need to have a burden that makes us plan out things. And then we need to have a burden that makes us act and actually do something. But see, that's the hard part. It's good to say in my mind, I'm going to take the risk. It's good to plan the risk out. The hard part is actually doing something about it. Saying that I'm going to step out of my comfort zone. Because listen, you might act like you're the coolest kid in the school. People might respect you. You might have so much street cred, and you might be the best athlete, or you might be the smartest person in the school. But guess what? If you're that type of person, you have a big influence of change that you can bring to your school by just sharing the love of Jesus. You want to cast out the darkness of hate? Start loving people the way you should. Guys, we need to start rebuilding the walls of the school district. We need to start rebuilding the walls of the classroom. We need to start rebuilding the walls of our lives. Why? Because it's the promises that God has given to us. But it starts with you. Trust me, man, if Ryan and I could walk into your school and just begin to preach about Jesus and just begin to love on every student and just begin to do it, we would do our best to do it. But you know what? Who's more effective at doing it than us is you. We walk in there like, what are these 2 30-year-old men with beards doing here? What's wrong with them? No one's going to listen to them. But they're weirdos. Why are they walking around my school? But you, as you begin to talk, as you begin to share love, you bring the change. You facilitate the change in the school. But guess what? You have to step up and you have to actually do it. So my question to you tonight as we're closing is, do you have a burden for your school? Or is it just something you're trying to get through? Do you have a plan of action to say, you know what, I'm going to share love even when it's hard? Because, that's when it's most important to share love, when it's hard. That's when it's most important. When the darkness seems the darkest, that's when it's time to shine a light so that people can see. But I want to encourage you guys that you can do this. Some of you are bold, man. Some of you are strong. Some of you are warriors. Some of you, listen, we spent a lot of time with some of you. We know how some of you are. Some of you are crazy. You ever hang out with Ray? Ray's crazy. He really is. We hung out yesterday. And he's just talking to me, and I'm thinking, this dude's crazy. But it's going to take people that are crazy enough to say, you know what? I don't care what people think about me, and I'm going to share love, and I'm going to make sure this city changes. Bow your heads and close your eyes tonight.